landscape there. And before I hand out the word to Theo, I would like to give a brief introduction about him. Theo is a registered professional natural sciences professional with more than 20 years experience in various advisory roles. He's also, next to his responsibilities with SAESA, is the managing director of eScience Associates, which is an environmental and energy consultancy specializing in climate and renewable energy. Most of his work is focused on helping to make defensible decisions when it comes to energy transition. And this is definitely the case right now in South Africa. So Theo, very, very pleased to welcome you today. I'm going to give you access to sharing your screen and start your presentation. And I also invite you to turn on your camera so that our listeners can follow you. Hello, Theo, welcome.
Hi, good afternoon, John, and to everybody on the presentation. Let me just move. I've got dual screens, and let me just make sure that I can properly present now. So I think, thank you for the introduction. I think I'm not going to go into the details of why one should have energy storage. I just want to see, must I share my screen, or are you, can I drive the presentation?
Yeah, you can share your screen. Please go ahead.
Okay.
I will tell you once your screen is up. Yes, there we go. And then just put it in presentation mode for ease of following, and then we can get started.
There we go.
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm presenting on behalf of the South African Energy Storage Association. And I just have to acknowledge that certain grid transmission grid diagrams were supplied and adapted from Mr. Ronald Murray from ESCOM. I think I'm not
interrupting you just a little bit.
Yes.
If you could just make sure that your slide is showing in the full screen, because there is like an red message on your screen, plus also your next slide showing. Pardon. There we go. Yeah, thank you.
Is this good?
Yeah, this will be good.
Okay. So I'm not going to go into the merits of energy storage. I think this must have been covered at some length by previous presentations, but I think, you know, in essence, storage is concerned with the matching of supply and demand of variable supplies and variable demand sources. I think very importantly, globally and also in South Africa, is the context of the transition. The question is, what transition is it that you are facing? And there are a transition to be faced at various levels, from that of a household to large urban conurbations to those of industries, and then of settlements, rural settlements, which currently are not served by the grid. So I think, in essence, the consensus would be that our transition is concerned with a transition away from fossil fuels to renewables and lowest cost electricity. And I'm going to use some diagrams in the presentation to schematically indicate the transition. And so, as you can see, what we have here in South Africa is mostly fuel storage in the form of coal-fired generation, transmission and distribution to the load. And then there's also limited at load generation. That's typically found in off-grid areas and more so in the rest of Africa. So we will be primarily concerned with the transmission system scenario. So I just want to confirm that you can see my cursor in the presentation, because what we have here is
Not
what
yet.
I call, can you see it there?
Yeah, now we can, yes.
Okay, thank you. So this I turn off the signal and the noise. So obviously there's a lot that's being said about the transition and about storage and about renewables and so on. And so we'll start here with a diagram. And what this really is a year-long plot of the yield of a PV plant, which you can see immediately from this curve, and of a wind facility, a wind energy facility. And all these lines is essentially production at some point in time. And what's really important here is to look at the maximum. So in this instance, we have a maximum yield of PV, but its average is much lower than that. So that would be the average capacity factor. And it's got a very characteristic curve that we're all familiar with. And here's a similar line for wind. But what you can see here is that at the top, if this is 100 megawatts, on average, we'll probably get perhaps 50, 40, depending on the capacity factor. But what's very important here is that we need to have a transmission system that can carry the maximum, or at least something close to the maximum. So we need to consider that, much like supplying water through a pipe, electricity through a transmission network is not always at full capacity. And specifically solar and wind energy has lower capacity factors than what many fossil fuel generation facilities would have. Although South African coal generation capacity factors are deteriorating and is probably sitting at in the low 60s, it's still much higher than what the renewables will be providing. The next consideration is the matching of supply and demand. And what we have here in this diagram at the top is the South African demand profiles, along with the PV profile and the wind profile. And it's immediately clear that we have a mismatch here. And if we put this in a diagram, then we can see if we were to undertake a transition and we are producing both wind and solar energy, on average, we will have periods of excess and shortfall and excess and shortfall, depending on the ratio of solar to wind. And this is just schematically where storage will come in, is to essentially store the excess energy into a store of sorts, which will then supply the shortfall. And in many instances, it has to be realized that there will be spillage or curtailment where the system just cannot take this electricity. And it's a characteristic of cost-optimized systems that there will be some spillage as opposed to optimally matching demand. So generally speaking, processes where demand is optimally matched, cost optimally matched, there's spillage of energy generated. So for South Africa, what does this mean? If we are targeting renewables for lowest cost clean electricity, we need to consider our current transmission network. And what you can see here is essentially the transmission network and the generation of yesterday, where substantial volumes of electricity or capacity of electricity is generated in the interior, and this is supplied to coastal areas and the southern interior through a transmission network. And schematically, we have the coal generation system, a transmission system, with some storage on the grid. So essentially, the South African grid of old has coal generation mostly, except for some nuclear generation in the Cape and some peaking power, which we're not including here. But importantly, there's already substantial pumped hydro on the transmission network to assist in balancing supply and demand. Now, what is happening now is that today, some of the coal-based generation has been decommissioned, or at least idled, or has become unavailable. We will allocate them as decommissioned. And we now have PV and wind of utility scale coming in. But it's got to be realized that for a coal facility at a capacity factor of 66%, arguably, we need one solar and one wind generator of combined half that capacity factor. So that means we need additional transmission infrastructure. And what you can see here on this diagram is the beginning of the reversal of energy flows. The flows from the interior down has been replaced by flows from areas of high renewable energy yields, and the system is in the process of being reversed. However, this system is limited by the transmission system. Also, what's important to note is the uptake of generation at load, where we increasingly seeing rooftop PV, both on commercial and industrial scale, as well as at households, with the introduction of battery energy storage at the load. And what we're seeing here is the emergence of what one could describe as a new ecosystem, where there's a greater variety of generation sources, distributed generation sources, but also increasingly we'll see the introduction of storage. So if we look at the grid of tomorrow, you will immediately see that we will have substantially increased generation of renewables from the interior, and a continuation of the reversal of energy production into the interior. For this, in order to enable this, increased transmission will need to be developed. And in order to optimize the transmission, we will need to also introduce further storage, both on the transmission system, but most importantly, we will need to include storage at generation. And this is not only storage at the renewable generation PV and wind sites, but increasingly we will see further generation of solar, rooftop solar, and the uptake of battery energy storage at the load center. I think it's important then also to consider in a country like South Africa that's blessed with substantial renewable energy resources, including solar and wind, how an optimal fit of storage and generation may look like. And it's not always easy to answer that. And there's some complex modeling that can go into it. But a first schematic analysis would indicate that due to the regular solar cycle and its periodic excess that is very periodic in terms of the demand pattern relative to uncertain wind energy profile that varies from day to day. An analysis indicates that storage utilization coupled to PV generation provides relatively better utilization of the storage capacity. So we anticipate that we will see an increased uptake of renewable battery energy storage and storage generally coupled to PV than to wind, as this will allow transmission of energy both from the production during the demand period, but also to store this energy for release at night when this transmission infrastructure is essentially unutilized. Then the next consideration is the uptake of rooftop solar and battery energy storage at load. As I've mentioned, we expect to increasingly see the uptake of rooftop in centers of load, especially in the urban areas. And South Africa, although not very densely populated, has dense urban conurbations, specifically the Gauteng interior, the Western Cape Town conurbation, and then also in KwaZulu-Natal. And it's to be expected that households and commercial and industrial facilities will increasingly generate their own electricity, and we can anticipate that, especially with the uptake of electric vehicles, that we will see a transition or a paradigm shift where not only will renewable energy come from renewable energy resources far afield, but we will see increasingly that generation will take place at load, and that that demand and generation will further be balanced by the utilization of battery energy storage at the point of consumption in these urban areas. So I think that's essentially just the analysis of the South African transition in a nutshell, and we can now take some questions if there are any, and I think I should be on time.
You are extremely well on time. Thank you, Theo. And maybe you can stop sharing your presentation so we see you full screen for the few questions that I have for you.
There we go.
First question that I have for you is, so if I understood your graphic correctly, there's going to be a reversal of the flow of energy on the South African grid. Maybe a stupid question from me, but does this have any implications? Like, can the energy just naturally flow from one side to the other, no problem? Or is this a lot more complex than a little graph?
I have to first indicate that I'm not fully qualified to answer that question in exact detail. But I can indicate that the system is currently set up to feed electricity from the northern interior, from the coal fields, into the rest of the country. And this is a transmission system, so the transmission of the electricity can can be reversed to the extent that feed-in substations are available. What I haven't included in my presentation is that the transmission network supplying the northern, or that was traditionally supplying the Northern Cape, has already been fully subscribed for the injection of renewable and mostly solar, but also some wind energy back into the interior. So essentially, instead of the water being piped a downslope or from the interior to the coast, this has been reversed. From the Western Cape, we're in a similar position. I think there is a very small amount of transmission access capacity that's left. And the Eastern Cape has some capacity left, but it's also constrained. So there's a number of, there's a couple of interventions that will have to come about in order to ensure the transition, and that is a combined upgrade of the transmission capacity to allow a higher volume to be reversed. And then secondly, there's the introduction of battery energy storage or storage in order to utilize the existing transmission or the transmission capacity more fully, more productively, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answered the question.
Yes, definitely. And actually, there's a follow-up question from Thomas, wondering if any financial evaluation has been done between the two options of feeding a lot of renewable energy into the transmission at this scale, as opposed to working with more decentralized mini-grids kind of network. Thomas is wondering if it would not be more cost efficient to work with more decentralized projects. Can you tell us something about this?
Look, it's a very complex question. And what I can say is that South Africa has a substantial transmission network, substantial transmission and distribution network as it stands. So the imbalance is a substantial demand that is located in the industrial heartland of Gauteng, which is currently supplied from the nearby coal field. If I have to guess, it would be a balance, and I can't exactly say what proportions that would be. Utility scale generation at the distance may have some cost advantages, especially in terms of wind energy. But in terms of solar energy resources, the gradient from the north and west into the interior and the relative economic attractiveness of generation of solar energy away where we have better resources relative to the generation of solar energy at consumption is fairly little. So I would envisage that a substantial volume of generation will take place in a distributed manner, but closer to consumption than utility scale production over extensive distances. But to answer your question, that modeling still has to be fully, what would the term be, fully implemented or undertaken, and it's obviously a fairly complex model and assessment that has to be undertaken.
Maybe one last question for you, Theo, and I know this is going to go a little bit outside of the specific situation in South Africa. Obviously, I mean, you mentioned about more and more people installing storage and solar at their house directly. I'm sure many of them also, because of the load shedding, just install storage. And this is also something we see in many other locations in Africa with very weak and unreliable grids. People install storage for charging the batteries up whenever the grid is available to be able to last and have electricity access when the grid is off. What exactly is the potential impact of this after some load shedding time? If the power comes back on and everybody starts charging their battery again, isn't it an even bigger problem on the grids than the solution we are trying to provide?
I think your comment is fair, and the sort of scale or the size of storage that is installed, essentially to provide, let's call it, some backup power during load shedding, relative to the size of storage that accompanies rooftop PV. I think they're quite different. I think there's obviously a substantial, with each spell of load shedding, there is uptake of, or there is the installation of batteries, most definitely. And when power comes back onto the grid, I think, you know, that extra demand, along with the demand from specifically thermal hot water systems, geysers and whatever else, and that will definitely have an impact. We have seen that the very high demand upon the ceasing of a load shedding event, that the very high demands that come onto the system has been problematic. But I think there's also substantial solar and household and commercial and industrial solar rooftop development or movement to develop own generation. And it's currently estimated that there must be around 2 gigawatts of solar rooftop that's already been installed. So I can imagine that this trend will continue, and that we'll see that expanding into a type of distributed generation, but where this generation takes place closer to load centers, and we imagine that this will favor PV generation.